wonderful book. Thanks so much for the introduction, Helena. And I have to say that I think possibly it's so autobiographical precisely because I was stuck in a room for 2 years when I was writing it. And now that it's actually going to hit the shops, I'm thinking, what on earth was I thinking of? But no. It depends where you're from. But yes, so I'd like to just start reading really the background of where it came from. I should say it starts actually with me being stood up at the Berlin Wall in 1989, but I'm not going to read about that right now. The impact of the World Wide Web did not hit us suddenly like the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. There is no 9th of November to celebrate the technological revolution. Rather, it has crept up on us like the slow and steady devastation of coastal erosion. Each new wave of useful and entertaining tech chipping away the walls of our consciousness until one day we woke up to discover that our mental geography had been fundamentally altered. For me, the revelation came while scrolling mindlessly through Facebook on a dark winter night in January 2017. In among the Christmas holiday photos from beaches, mountains, and brightly lit cityscapes around the world, I came across an article that made me sit up and think. It was a now infamous story about data, Brexit, Trump, and Cambridge Analytica, originally published in German by Swiss investigative journalists on a small online news website. The article lit a light, a blue light that wouldn't let me sleep. I read and reread. I stepped away from the screen. I remembered the night of the Brexit referendum in June 2016, checking my Facebook account and going to bed early, sure that in the end, the European project that had been built with such hope on the ruins left by the Second World War would win the day. Facebook told me what I wanted to hear. After 20 years of work on human rights in Europe, everyone I knew on Twitter and Facebook agreed with me, and I slept soundly. But somehow, in the morning, it was clear that the country did not agree with my Facebook feed. Could it be that my complacency had been curated? Had I been lulled into a false sense of security so that I would not see the need to speak up? Whether this was the case or not, the idea that this could be true, that my smartphone could be used as a portal to manipulate my mind, felt like a personal assault. That this could have been done en masse to manipulate the results of elections that could change our very futures was an existential threat to the democratic society I grew up in, and one that, at the time, worryingly few people were talking about.
And that started you off on a sort of much deeper inquiry, and as a lawyer, you had been a very, you were really at the heart of many of the major cases that were taking place in the European Court of Human Rights. You were an expert in European law. You had lived and spent time in Europe, and so the whole European project to try, and it's important, there I'm sure people in the audience who saw the European project as really being about economics and trade and so forth. But for many of us, it was about trying to create some sort of way in which law, sorry, of course, I keep forgetting, a way in which law could actually, there'd be a recognition of the ways in which you could establish norms, and by establishing norms, move people to a better place in terms of the protections, and protections for minorities, but protections for all of us. And somehow, one was seeing an erosion of that. I just would like you to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a large part of my work was on human rights in the policy space, so about developing human rights law in Europe, whether that was in the European Union, so working for Amnesty International about getting human rights at the heart of European Union developments, or working for the OSCE on human rights and counterterrorism. And it was looking at the ways that human rights and legal international law frameworks were able to keep the peace, if you like, and keep stability in Europe to the extent that we all became really complacent about it. But I think it was that shift for me about how I understood it. I'd spent years writing policy papers about privacy and data protection, but frankly I found it quite boring and sort of nothing to do with me. So I knew what the law said. I could write press releases about it till the cows come home, but I never really felt it. I mean, I remember traveling frequently around Europe and beyond, and actually scanning my own iris for the iris scan, because it would make it much quicker for me to go through Heathrow on my way home, and I could get back to my bed faster. Even though, you know, I had colleagues working in privacy and security who would sort of look at me as they were standing in the queue with their passports, thinking I was absolutely crazy. Yes, and I just thought, well, you know, it's easy, isn't it? And so privacy never really struck home. I never really got it. But it was this behavioural micro-targeting, the description of what Cambridge Analytica, and I mean, they're just one of many companies and organisations that have embarked on this idea that what they were doing was getting a personalised vision of what goes on inside your head from your data, and using that to change what was going on inside your head, even if only slightly, to alter the way you behave. And it was that, when it came to, actually, this isn't about data and privacy, this is about freedom of thought. And that really was just something that I felt was so fundamentally violating that I couldn't let it go. And I mean, it was 3 years on from that when your radio show, radio documentary was made. 3 years on from that I finally got the book deal. And it was because over those 3 years I just couldn't put it down, even though I was sort of on a one-woman mission, because it felt so violating.
I want us to go back to I mean, this is not, your book is not the Cambridge Analytica analysis of all of that. It's not, that's not what this is about. It's about something much more fundamental. And I really want the audience to know and understand what it was that was so alarming. I mean, this is a sort of new Orwell kind of alert. It really is the bell tolling. And so I just wanted you to explain a bit more about what it is that you see as so profoundly challenging about all of this. Because to many people, I mean, you know, it started off, I always make the joke is that, you know, it starts off with a crowd of geeky guys who create Facebook because they can't get girls. Yeah. You know, how do you get a girlfriend? And they have the audacity to start, giving them a kind of 3 stars or 2 or whatever. And that was before the thumbs up or thumbs down that young women suffer from now. But it was really about getting yourself a girlfriend. And then it has turned into something which, of course, was about how do you monetize that thing? And monetizing it has become the great challenge. But the monetizing has been the start of it, because, of course, in monetizing it for commercial purposes, and now data, I would suggest, has become more valuable in our world than any other commodity, probably even more than oil. And we're left with the fact that it now is permeated into our political sphere too.
Yeah, I think what really shocked me when I started looking into it was how all-pervasive it is. And I think that's one of the reasons as well for making the book personal, was to show that this is about all of us. It's not about foreigners and criminals, which is what normally when people talk about human rights, it's not me.
It's always about terrorists and people.
Exactly. Yeah. So I wanted to make it very clear that this is a threat to all of our human rights in many different ways. And as I say, it started out with sort of Cambridge Analytica, but then I realised that this kind of profiling and targeting is happening in so many different spheres of our lives. So whether it is your teenager on Instagram suddenly finding themselves depressed and going and getting, you know, ridiculous scales of plastic surgery because
self-harming,
because they've been told that this is what they're supposed to be like by the way that their minds are being manipulated through profiling and targeting. But it's also even about whether or not you can get a mortgage. I mean, as an ombudsman at the Financial Ombudsman Service, I remember getting a case, one of the last cases I did, where effectively the computer had said no, a woman's credit had been cut. They couldn't actually explain what it was. It was that the big data said that she was worth this much risk all of a sudden, and nobody could explain what she'd done or what it was about her that had changed. It was the data, and it was essentially, there was something inherently risky. And I think in financial services, you see that all over the place. But it goes down as well to little bits of data you don't even think about. one of my favourite observations that I found, which Hannah Fry had spoken about in her fantastic book, Hello World, was that apparently buying fresh fennel in the supermarket is the prime indicator of trustworthiness. So if you want to lower your insurance premiums, go on a binge of buying fresh fennel, apparently. And so
is that because it's such a middle class pursuit?
Absolutely. Probably if you buy in Waitrose, it's even better.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I remember years and years ago having a conversation with a very senior executive in Google, and he said to me, "We know when kids are gay before they know that they're gay," and of course we know of those stories of women who had still not told their partner that they were pregnant because they'd gone online to find out, to get a pregnancy test or to make inquiries about how you might know if you were and all that sort of thing. That others knew before your most intimate relations knew. So it is an interesting, challenging thing. But apparently Nadine Dorris went into a meeting and said, when are you, with the big tech companies, and said, when are you going to abolish algorithms? A woman of great knowledge and intellect. And of course, the thing is that the whole computer methodology is built around algorithms. So why are we surprised that the algorithms should be used in these ways?
I think that's one of the big problems when you look at human rights and technology, is that there's a real tendency to say this is all really complicated and sort of don't worry your pretty head about it. And certainly I kind of felt like that before having this sort of light bulb moment. I was really like, well, it's all complicated. But actually the problem is not the technology, it's what it's being used for and what it's being designed for. And what I found the more I looked into it was that the general trajectory of technological development at the moment is about getting inside our minds and changing how they work. That is, a big business model for developments in neuroscience, but also developments generally, tech startups. It's about what can you, how far can you get inside and what can you do with it? And so that's why I feel that there's a sort of broader conversation, which is this fundamental question of what actually is it okay to allow technology to do? What direction of developments need to be shut down, if you like? And that hopefully, if we can have a discussion about what this fundamental problem is, then maybe we will change the direction.
The starting point, it seems to me, now that there's a bill going through Parliament, which is an online safety bill. It started off being called an online harms bill, but somehow they were persuaded to change the name.
Glass half full.
Yeah, and that bill, the work that started amongst lawyers on that was really looking at children. Because it's, if you like, it's the soft way in to say the design of this stuff has never had children in mind, and how do you create protections for children, and there seems to have been an unwillingness to do that, where kids are introduced, they're also used as buyers because they're so persuasive of their parents to get them to buy the stuff that they want. But also the companies have not been very active in preventing porn reaching them either. So I mean, is that the way in which the people have opened up their minds to the risks that there are?
I think one of the big problems is that we still haven't had that shift to recognise that it's the systems that are the problem, not necessarily the content. So there are problems of obviously, child sexual abuse and exploitation, which is the pointy end, if you like, of the horrendous harms.
It's the easy end in a way in which to get them feeling.
Yeah, but I think
nervous.
but the problem with the systems is much wider than that, and that's where you then get into this question of, is content lawful but harmful? But actually, it's not the content. It's not what one person says. It's about the way a girl in particular, girls have been particularly affected by, for example, Instagram, that they are being identified as someone who is vulnerable to messages about extreme weight loss, if you like. And once that vulnerability is identified, then they are bombarded with this information. And so, in a way, you know, Nadine Dorries is right that in some ways the algorithm is the problem.
With the algorithm.
But it's not every algorithm, clearly. It's about how they operate, that profiling and targeting that's being used to manipulate people. And, you know, Reset Australia did some very interesting research where they were able to buy advertising through Facebook for a couple of dollars, really, to target thousands of teenagers who had been identified as having interests in dangerous activities like dating older men, alcohol, extreme weight loss. And for a few dollars, you can buy directed access at these kids who've been identified as vulnerable. You know, that there is the problem, is that actually it's not about whatever the message says, it's about how the system works and how it can be exploited.
Given that it's systemic, how do you address that problem? I mean, in a society where we value freedoms, we do not want you know, the heavy hand of the state. We also know that the chances are that that, you know, it's likely to end up being putting power into the hands of people that might not want to have the power. So how do you do that?
I think you need to start deciding what things can never be allowed, and there are a few things. So I think there are two ways of dealing with that. I'll start with the first big problem, I think, of addressing it is that the whole tech space has been dealt with in a way that talks about ethics, not about law and human rights. And there's been this argument that you stifle innovation if you start regulating. So there's this sort of fear that we're going to stifle innovation. But I think it's also interesting that we saw last year, I think it was last year, the year before, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, talking about the freedom to be human, which I think is essentially the freedom of thought that he was talking about. And he was saying that if the kind of technology that exists today, this ability to get inside our minds and manipulate them, had existed 30 years ago, then Silicon Valley itself could never have happened. The kind of innovation that we see would never have happened. So essentially, you know, technological innovation would eat itself. So I think there is starting to be a shift to recognize this fundamental problem. But I think we do have to be prepared to regulate and to say that there are certain things that will never be acceptable. One of the big things, and you know, as you're very well aware, the work of Shoshana Zuboff around surveillance capitalism.
She's very interesting, yeah.
Absolutely, and she similarly has explored the way that this ecosystem touches on so many aspects of our life. And I think one of the things that could be done that would absolutely shift the direction is to say that surveillance advertising, which is this kind of advertising where how you're feeling and what kind of a person you are at any specific moment is identified and then is effectively auctioned in real time online. So when you look at a website, your eyes are being auctioned globally for targeted advertising. And that's based not only on whether you're interested in camping, and so maybe you'd like a tent advert, but it might also be based on you having been identified as someone who's neurotic, maybe someone who doesn't buy fresh fennel, you know, maybe someone who's looking at this website at 2 o'clock in the morning, so maybe they're a bit miserable because they're stuck on their screen, you know, in bed. All of those factors are going into your eyes being sold around the world. And one of the things I think is fascinating is that a lot of the problems that we're seeing are driven by the money that comes from, whether it's surveillance advertising, whether it's political micro-targeting, but it's the money and the power behind it. And this power of surveillance advertising is so huge, and so, you know, whether or not it works is a different matter, but clearly why it's worth money is because people believe that it is working, which is important. One of the things that I found amazing was with subliminal advertising, which I think has very close similarities to surveillance advertising. Subliminal advertising was this idea that you could flash images very quickly up on a screen while someone was watching a movie, so quickly that they wouldn't even be aware that they'd seen this advertising. So wouldn't that be much better for everyone? Because they could all have the benefits of having advertising targeted at them without actually having to worry about looking at boring adverts while they were in the cinema. And this was obviously identified by lawmakers as something so dangerous and such a dreadful idea that in Europe, at least, they just banned it. It's still debatable whether or not it actually works. But you don't have to wait to know that it works to see that this is an absolutely horrendous and dangerous idea for all of us. Somehow, surveillance advertising has happened and grown sort of cumulatively without us noticing and without this sort of horrific, we can't have this moment. And so I sort of hope that maybe looking at surveillance advertising the same way we look at subliminal advertising and having a sort of hard stop on it might well at least stop fueling this direction of travel that we've got in technological innovation.
I mean, Shoshana Zuboff, who we've just mentioned, who's, was, I think she's still at Harvard. She's really looked at this stuff, and as a sociologist, not as a lawyer, and is really persuasive about just how damaging all of this is. And she has given you a wonderful quote on the back of your book, which we rather like.
The front.
We wanted to know. There is the problem that it is linked so much with innovation. In our minds, innovation, the entrepreneurship, being at the front end of so much of this stuff, not wanting to inhibit it, is important, and we want that. But so the dilemma of finding a way of regulating that is not going to undermine that is the challenge, isn't it?
I think it is, but like I say, I do have hope from Tim Cook's address to Stanford that made me quite hopeful that maybe actually tech innovators are recognising the danger of this. And peppered throughout the book are quotes from George Orwell. It was kind of impossible to look at this stuff without looking at George Orwell. And I felt a bit like a masochist as I started lockdown reading 1984 and recognising that the parallels.
There were parallels. I want to talk to you about propaganda because it is a real. The parallels, of course, are there. But I mean, one of the things about propaganda is that it gets in early enough, and I think there's some sort of parallels here. If you get in early enough so that people don't formulate independent ideas, it's not about keeping your ideas secret in that space in there. You don't even formulate the ideas to challenge because you're not given the kind of information that would stimulate that kind of inquiry. So, I mean, what do you do about that? I mean, isn't there an element of that going on here too?
Well, I think it's about information control. And again, it goes back to these systems. And when you're looking at tackling disinformation and misinformation, looking at whether or not a specific piece of content is false is kind of missing the point. And you can see that the fact that now Russia has brought in. I mean,
the whole business of what's happening. I mean, and apparently, Putin's enjoying an increase in popularity in support from his people.
Absolutely, and so it is about information control, and whether that information is being controlled by governments or by corporations, I think matters. And one of my favourite pieces of research that I came across when I was writing the book was some researchers in the US who went to a Flat Earth conference. I don't know if anyone in the room's ever felt inspired to go to a Flat Earth conference, but if you spend long enough on YouTube and show that kind of inclination, you might well get there. Yes, absolutely. And what was fascinating was that they interviewed as many people as they could at this conference to ask them how they came to the conclusion that the Earth was flat. And the conclusion, strongly enough held conviction that meant that they would actually shell out their own money and get on a plane and go and hang out in a conference with a load of other people thinking the same thing. And every single one of them, bar one, got there through YouTube. They were interested in other conspiracy theories, whether it was 9/11, whether it was climate denial, whatever it was that was their starter conspiracy theory. YouTube recognized that they had this capacity and took them on a journey that convinced them that the Earth was flat. And the only one person who didn't get there through YouTube was persuaded by his son and daughter-in-law who had got there through YouTube, and they'd brought him along for the ride. But I think that just shows the power of this kind of profiling and recommender algorithms.
But I mean, it reaches into that place where let's think about the 6th of January of, where what happened at the at Capitol Hill, where people who had been persuaded that there was a stolen election went there. And it presents you with, I was imagining myself as a criminal defense lawyer acting for some of those people in saying that some of the stuff that people were receiving was so highly persuasive that there was a stolen election, that do you attach criminality to the individual where they're receiving a bombardment of information which is telling them that a terrible affront to democracy is taking place and they have to reclaim their nation?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, isn't it?
As a lawyer, it's one of those things.
Of how the internet potentially undermines our capacity to make decisions.
And so there are interesting issues in all of that. Making a confession, Microsoft set up an advisory council on human rights, and I think it was because they were being challenged on a number of things, most particularly on facial recognition and their engagement with China on that, and I can't pretend that I haven't given them a bad time over the fact that of what's been happening with the Uyghur in Xinjiang province, because there is no doubt that facial recognition has become a powerful tool in oppression, and so all those benign things that were claimed for it in helping crime reduction and all that sort of stuff, it's really in the hands of regimes. It can be used to really malign purposes. And also moving to that thing, which of course Orwell wrote about, which was the business of reading in images of the face intent and what's going on in the head.
Absolutely, and I think the more I looked into things, the more concerned I was, and I'm deeply concerned that I just got a new iPhone despite myself, and then discovered that the only way to open it is
facial recognition.
I'm not sure how long I'm going to last with it, but yeah, the way that our faces are being interpreted, and again, whether or not it's all rubbish doesn't really matter, and I think that's one of the keys, looking at what the drafters of the UDHR and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights noted, was that it doesn't matter whether someone gets you right. Making inferences about what's going on inside your head can be a violation regardless of whether it's true. And I don't know if you remember, I think it was probably 2018 or something, that there was a lot of news about virtual gaydar. And there's a researcher who's now at Stanford, who was previously at Cambridge, who claimed that he could tell just by still photographs of people's faces what their sexual orientation was.
They can do it in our politics, apparently.
Well, yes, it's the same guy.
Leftyism, and folks somehow know.
Yeah, well, it's the same guy. So, luckily he's moved on from sexual orientation to politics, helpfully. And he sort of says that he's doing this work because he wants to show how dangerous this stuff is. But if you think that this was based on still photographs and the machines were trained on images that have been scraped off the internet, off Facebook, and also off dating websites, which have huge amounts of information. And obviously, if you want to check sexual orientation, dating websites are the best place to see, what people are looking for. But this supposed virtual gaydar, again, it doesn't matter if they get you right. If you find yourself being arrested on arrival in a country where there is death penalty for being gay, try arguing that the algorithm got you wrong. It really doesn't matter whether it's right. But this, again, I think there are some uses of technology and using facial recognition or using biometrics to identify things like sexual orientation or political opinions is something that just should never be allowed. And I think, if we make those judgment calls now as these things are coming up, then we will see at least a halt to those developments. Whereas if we just sit there going, isn't this terrible? Then these developments are going to continue if they're not legally regulated and prevented. And some of them just seem so obvious that you kind of think, really, is anyone honestly going to debate that you ought to be able to judge someone's sexual orientation from their photograph?
But of course, I mean, have you had a look at the Online Safety Act?
I have, but not in detail.
No, okay. Because it does seem like a tepid piece of legislation, given the challenges here. One of the things that has surprised me is that in this moment where we're looking more critically on Putin than was the case until not that long ago, the whole business of Putin's role in, if you like, undermining democracies in the West, whether in the United States over the election of Trump, whether in Britain over the whole the Brexit thing, things that may have happened in any event, but where he has had a hand in the technological, using troll farms and the like. There's suddenly a greater willingness to accept that he may have played a role in that. And yet at the time, and until comparatively recently, if you even raised it, it was suggested that you were some sort of mad conspiracy theorist yourself.
Yeah.
So I wondered what you felt about all of that.
I think, again, one of the things that's important about the way our information is sort of managed, and disinformation, fake news, whatever you want to call it, is that it's not necessarily as well about making you believe one thing or changing your opinions. It can be just about sowing confusion and or distraction. And when I look back at the history, if you like, of propaganda, and the British in the First World War, I think were absolutely at the pinnacle of the development of propaganda.
That's why I loved the book so much, was it all this great stuff.
Yeah, no, one of my favourite stories about that was about British reports, I think it was in the Daily Mail and the Times, about German corpse factories. So they said that there were reports which cited foreign reports elsewhere to make them look credible, which is what you also see in the online space, that it sort of cites sources that themselves have been sown. And they said that the Germans were boiling down their dead soldiers and using them to make sort of glue and other byproducts. And that this was an indication that the Germans were just so inhuman that, this drove the hatred of the Germans and the war effort. In the 1920s, the British government recognised that actually this corpse factory story had been made up and sown by them. It wasn't actually true. It was based on two kind of half-truths. One, the Germans were cremating their war dead, and two, they were boiling down dead war horses for glue, which probably, so were the British, I don't know, but it would have been a relatively normal thing to have been happening at that time. And this was sort of conflated. But this visceral idea, even the smell of these corpse factories, was so sort of persuasive that, it drove this hate of the Germans. But then when it was revealed that actually it wasn't true and that it was propaganda, that then undermined belief in information sources.
Anything.
To the degree that when then we were getting reports about Nazi concentration camps coming back, nobody believed it, because, we're not falling for that twice. And that's something that you can see, now, with the way that fake news and all the sort of discussions and all the information warfare we've seen in the US in recent years, and we're now then seeing the Russians saying, well, Bucha is a staged event and this is all fake news.
But how different is that from things like, there's now a public discussion taking place about in the post-Iraq war period. People were so horrified. There was a reluctance, for example, to deal with what the Russians were doing in Syria and their collaboration with, with Assad and barrel bombs and the use of chemical warfare. And there was inaction because everyone was so sickened to the teeth with what happened in Iraq. And so, those sort of things happen in a sort of reactive thing to any of those horrors. Do we think that the thing about the internet and social media and so on is that it is an amplifier of that?
I think it's partly an amplifier, but also, we may all in this room be getting different news feeds. So I think that is one of the problems. So it sort of will harness what is going to make you hate the enemy, or what is going to make you buy this color socks, whatever it is, it's about you as an individual. And I think that is what is completely different to previous waves of propaganda, is that it is personalized and targeted, not just on you, but on you, how you're feeling now. And that as well comes from, the idea of behavioral micro-targeting came as well from research that Facebook did about mass social contagion. And they found that just by manipulating people's news feeds, and again, if you've got Facebook, which I'm afraid I still have, and any of us may well have been targeted by this. They did experiments on unknown individuals around the world and found that by massaging your news feed, so not about targeting you with flat earth sort of stories, but just massaging your news feed so that you got either predominantly negative or predominantly positive news feed, they could change the way you felt as an individual. So, on a mass scale around the world, they could take people in the morning and make them either feel elated and distracted or absolutely despairing sort of by the end of the day. And so that power to manipulate us on an individual level en masse, I think, is what's different today.
I kind of really became aware of it when a woman friend who lives in California told me that she had a discussion with her father, who was a Republican, and it was about, it was in the run-up to the election in which Donald Trump was elected. And you'll remember the moment at which it was disclosed that he had, they had him on tape saying, grab women by their pussies and all that. And we all thought that he would never survive the full horror of that. Yeah. Anyway, little did we know. Anyway, and she told me that she sat with her father and said, "But look what he's done, Dad." And and he was saying, "It was not so bad. I don't know what you're talking about. Why are you making such a fuss about this?" And she went to her phone, and he went to his phone, and what was coming up on her phone was decidedly different from what he was receiving on his. And his was a little bit of locker room banter and whatever and so on, and he was being encouraged to a certain way of thinking about it, as distinct from her as a woman who was receiving stuff about how we as women experience that kind of abusive behaviour.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's really disturbing, and even. Even with your same feed, I thought it was very interesting that, I think as well, it was probably in 2019, a group of teenagers in the US sort of got together because they realized they were being profiled and targeted on Instagram. And so they created this really elaborate network where they swapped each other's sort of phones and logged into each other's accounts from different phones and different locations to confuse the Instagram algorithm so that they would get, a neutral feed, if you like.
I'd like to learn how to do that.
No, absolutely, it's fascinating. But then you kind of think, well, surely, if these teenagers are so inventive and so keen to be avoiding this, then there is a business argument for creating something that doesn't do this in the first place.
I mean, one of the problems is that, and I'm sure it's an experience that everyone in the room has had, where they ask you about your cookies, and they say, do you want to sort of, manage your things? And it's so bloody complicated that you give up because you want to read the article that you're having difficulties in accessing. And so, if you make something complicated enough, then people will just not bother.
I think there is that, and I think that's why we need regulation. Laws to just say, actually, this is never okay. Because I think as well, when you're talking about nibbling around the edges, when you're talking about proportionality and data protection, etc., then people might risk a lawsuit to try out whether or not what they're doing is lawful. If something is very clearly completely illegal, most people don't want to do it. And so you'll find, again, this sort of change of trajectory. And, I'm not a technologist, so I don't necessarily know the methods. But I think there is this sort of a need to cut off certain lines. And I think the really narrow and detailed personalization is one of those things. And it's sort of like, well, you might like to get, as I said earlier, if you're interested in going on a camping holiday, well, you might like to get information or watch a documentary about going on a camping holiday, whatever it is. But do you actually really, really want to be constantly given a feed that is trying to interpret how you're feeling, trying to interpret what your interests are, and moulding them as a result. So I think putting limitations on personalisation of the information we get, I think, is important.
What was the thing that shocked you most when you were doing your research for the book?
I think the thing that shocked me most, actually, and I hadn't really thought about it at all beforehand, was period trackers. That was actually, and I just hadn't thought about it. In fact, I was off on a tangent about COVID track and trace, because that was the theme of the moment when I was looking at it. And my editor actually said, but what about period trackers? And I went and looked at it, and I couldn't believe that. I think they're the most widely downloaded apps by young women globally, or certainly of health apps. They're massive. But the information that's going into them is so intimate. You know, sort of people being asked whether they've had sex, how much they enjoyed it, you know, colour of their vaginal secretions, all this kind of information, as well as putting in your hormonal state. And that's then being used as well to give you helpful hints and nudges that maybe you might want to have a baby this year, because women your age are most likely to have a healthy pregnancy. So, you know, what on earth are you doing? And the idea that this kind of social control, you know, aside from the potential for privacy breaches and intimate partner abuse, and, you know, there are various things around that, but just generally the idea that women around the world, you know, that there are companies that know when you're feeling grumpy and are going to be able to harness that for whatever
Premenstrual
purpose.
tension.
Exactly. You know.
Do they warn your husband or your partner?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. That's a good question. Maybe that's the next idea. But, you know, that for me was something that I hadn't considered at all, and that I just thought, this is huge. This is huge, and you know, in a time where, you know, when I was growing up, you kind of felt like women's rights are done, aren't they? We've got equality, and obviously the older you get, the more you realise that's not true. But the idea of these huge troves of intimate data that are being used to not only understand how women are feeling on a sort of minute-by-minute basis, but also to manage how you might be feeling. I think that was the thing that most shocked me and that I hadn't expected.
That's so interesting. Now I'm going to take it out to the audience, but thank you, Susie. That was really, really fascinating. And I can see hands up. Please, could you take the mic? Oh.
Thank you.
Oh, good, okay.
So there's been a lot of talk about how kind of MI6, so how Facebook will know more about you than MI6. And you've spoken already about China, and you've also spoken about how Nadine Dorris and the government has responded to this kind of shift. But have you seen evidence or information about how security services in the West are using this kind of shift to understand how to control populations more?
I haven't really looked at it in detail, but I mean, it is the case that the way that surveillance is developing is based on this idea, I suppose, that we can interpret how people are thinking. And so, as Helena mentioned, there are examples of sort of security tech, if you like, being developed. So I think I quoted in the book an Israeli company that was claiming that by looking at a photograph, they could tell you whether or not someone was inclined to be a terrorist, you know, so that you could deal with them before they actually did anything. And you see that as well in emotion recognition technology, in the security sphere and the migration sphere, that certainly it's something that security companies want to be able to do. How successful it is, and it's companies that are then potentially selling to states, obviously, because that's where the big money is, I guess, in security.
I have absolutely no doubt that a lot of investment is going into this by the security services. I don't have any doubt about it at all. And when we made that radio program some years back, I interviewed somebody who was an American who who said he was working with the CIA on the development of we as lawyers have been very resistant to the idea of lie detector testing because it's been proved to be so, just unhelpful. It's just not reliable. And of course, that was always based on physiological signs. Your heartbeat increasing, you're sweating more because of certain kinds of questions, and so they would be monitoring your physiological responses. But now what they want to do is to have, your brain with, things on your head managing your responses to certain kinds of questions and where they see parts of your brain responding in an overactive way to certain sort of sensitive subjects and being able to draw deductions from that. And so, there is no doubt in my mind that a lot of work is going on that we know nothing about at this moment in time. But it's all linked to this stuff.
And again, I think that question is a sort of, does it really matter if it works? If you decide that a lie detector test or an fMRI is a violation of the right to freedom of thought, then it can't be allowed regardless of whether it's accurate or not. And I think that again comes down to this question of the direction of travel, about deciding if this did work, is it something that should ever be allowed anyway? Rather than getting in a kind of, they can't do it yet, so it's fine, we'll just wait.
But it was very interesting because talking to, having this interview with this guy, his thing was, think of how useful it would be to be able to detect that someone was a paedophile. And it's that classic thing that if you can use it in the scenario of the paedophile, whom everybody is, loathes, then it becomes an acceptable thing to do, that you're trying to locate amongst us those who might be a risk to our children. And so it was very interesting that he immediately made that his argument as to why this would be a valuable resource. Annalise. Yeah.
Oh, hi. So great discussion, Susie and Helena. So if you could indulge me, I have two high-level questions, because one is related to, I shall go back to the period tracker. Interestingly, what's interesting about that, one of the two biggest companies in the world actually has raised money through the conduit, which is quite interesting, as a sustainable investment that's consistent with the SDGs. But interestingly, that data has then been submitted to a global regulatory agency and has resulted in the first ever approval of a digital contraceptive, which is interesting because one might argue that the pace of innovation in the last 30 years has left our traditional models of regulation and the legal system way behind. And I wondered if you could just comment on that observation. And my second sort of bucket of questions is that one might also argue that over the last 30 years, this completely different interface between our minds and our environment has really resulted in this catastrophic epidemic of mental health issues that we're now seeing. And my question that I've been reflecting upon recently is why is it that the same people who are so brilliant and innovative have failed to identify that they're creating a catastrophic epidemic which is so profoundly impacting people's lives, and they're fundamentally responsible for it, but they don't sort of seem to feel engaged and motivated to be part of the solution. So those are my two questions.
Very, very interesting.
I think, on the first, a period tracker, it's supposed to be so that you as a woman can know when you're going to be fertile or not fertile, or when you're going to be happy or grumpy or whatever.
Instead of the Pope telling you that in the middle of the month you're more likely to get pregnant and therefore you should try to regulate your sexual activity around that, it's actually about really monitoring when you're most likely to be fertile and therefore to,
But they've been sort of sold beyond fertility, so it's just a sort of, every woman should own her body and know all
exactly
about it.
When she's likely to menstruate, because it'll be very useful to you, because you might avoid having meetings at that particular time, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is what it is, and they'll give you helpful hints as well in these apps, apparently, to help you make those decisions. So on the kind of wider regulation question, I think it partly goes back to, and that's something I talk about in the book as well, that we have certainly in the last 20 years, if not more, had this real erosion of respect for international law and human rights law as a sort of general project and this shift towards ethics. And ethics are optional, basically, whereas law, you kind of have to follow it. And we've seen this dismantling of international human rights law, which probably means, and I don't know, I'm looking forward to hearing more about this, but I would suspect that probably there wasn't a really in-depth analysis of the human rights implications. There or was there? No.
No, I was just going to say I could guarantee that there were none, because of course this is the issue, that our regulatory agencies that regulate food and drug, of course, we're not set up in that way, and certainly aren't staffed with individuals that have the right skills sets and capabilities. It's not a criticism, but that's my point, is that they're not fit for purpose for the modern world.
Yeah.
And so that's probably why there was absolutely no debate about ethics, morals, human rights, laws, because that's not the framework of regulation that's been established to apply to these technologies.
But I think that as well, when you look at regulation, obviously it's a bit harder when it's international, but even domestic, I think that again goes back to the broader possibility of having judicial review and of having a strong human rights law means that actually you can challenge these kind of decisions if you live in a society where those exist. So it's part of that broader concept. And the last one, I think you'd have to ask a technologist why they're not interested. I would just be speculating on their state of mind, really. But I think some of them are starting to wonder about that. And it's one of those things, the sort of story about big tech entrepreneurs not letting their children use their own technology because they sort of recognise the problems.
You try having this conversation with Brad Smith, I'm telling you, at Microsoft. His kids do not, they manage their access to tech stuff.
But again, I think law focuses the mind. So I sort of feel like, when people are doing things without having to face up to a clear argument that it's illegal, then they'll carry on, I think.
Who else would like to go? Please, here at the front.
So we have maybe discussed in the past how coming up with new human rights is not necessarily the solution for this, but rather using the ones we have.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned before, at a time when freedom of thought, conscience, religion or belief is mostly freedom of religion or belief, is our current international human rights architecture well suited to deal with these sort of issues?
I think it's shifting, and one of the things that I suppose I felt really happy about, my real positive takeaway is that when I first thought about freedom of thought, I thought I must have got it wrong because no one was talking about it. I found one article about neuroscience and freedom of thought, but nothing else. And so, obviously having imposter syndrome, I sat there thinking, well, I must have just got this wrong. Yes, I've got this wrong. And it was our late, lovely mutual friend, Jonathan Cooper, who was the editor of the European Human Rights Law Review, who published my first article on it. And I remember when I spoke to him about it, he said, wow, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's it. And he published that article, which meant that I then carried on this one-woman mission, and then it became a more-women mission with Helena doing this fantastic documentary. But it also, last year, just when the book was being finished, this UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief, who'd never done anything on freedom of thought before, did a standalone report on the right to freedom of thought, which hadn't been done before.
It is suddenly taking over. But what I loved that you dealt with here was that when Eleanor Roosevelt and her cohort of jurists were getting together to put together the Universal Declaration and to work out what are the things that are so fundamental to our humanity and that need to be protected. The kind of arguments that took place between, for example, the Soviets and those who were the sort of liberal Democrats and so on. And tell everyone.
Well, I think that was one of the fascinating things. There was a big debate about whether you needed freedom of thought, because we have freedom of opinion with freedom of expression, we had freedom of conscience, religion and belief, so why do we need freedom of thought? And it was interesting, the sort of the bedfellows that came together, that on the one hand we had Charles Malik, the Lebanese philosopher,
Great philosopher.
who was really big on the idea of humanity at the core, and the human individual, if you like.
And that this is our humanities located
Yeah,
here.
and our soul. So he
Yes,
he was very big on the soul as apart from sort of the religious.
He was a Christian Lebanese.
He
wasn't
was, but it was
Catholic.
that sort of that thought had to go beyond just about religion and belief, and that this was the sort of key. But then you had the Soviets on the other side who were saying we can't get rid of thought because we need freedom of thought to protect the martyrs of science. So the Soviets, who were generally anti the kind of individualistic idea of human rights, much more social rights. But on this, it was we have to protect the scientists, and that's why we need freedom of thought. And that's why, again, going back to this idea of innovation.
But thinking the unthinkable and being prepared to sort of go into spaces and thinking outside of the box and all of that, which is where invention comes from.
Absolutely, and for that you need this freedom of thought.
And it was interesting that the Soviets were there plugging that bit.
Absolutely.
The propagandists of all time. Please, our friend here, yes.
Thank you. Just one question. Well, one question and one thought. Why have you not deleted Facebook yet? That's one question. The second is that clearly tech outpaces the law, and we don't all want to be pessimistic. We want room for optimism. But if you look at Zuckerberg, he recruits Nick Clegg. Nick Clegg, I think, has a legal degree. Nick Clegg's wife is a lawyer. He knows exactly what he's doing. And so the lobby groups that these people have and the money they have is likely to be greater than anyone else comes up to counter. And we've already heard that the legislation is already being watered down, and it's quite Orwellian that it was changed from harms to safety. So, these people are incredibly clever. They know exactly what they're doing. They have all the resources. They have all the money. So how on earth, in reality, can successful change for the better come about?
On the first question, it's complicated. Firstly, I suppose the personal approach is that having lived in lots of places around the world for years, a lot of my friends, the connection is through Facebook, who I would have lost elsewhere. Yeah, absolutely, that's how they get you. So that there's that, although I actually don't look at it very often until I want to reach out to somebody. But the bigger answer is because I realised that actually it doesn't matter if you've got Facebook. They're tracking you anyway. And another thing that I found really fascinating was that we've moved on from, while we had this Facebook knows you better than you know yourself. Well, Facebook knows you regardless of whether you've got Facebook because of all your friends and everything else. Exactly. So it doesn't matter if you delete Facebook. That's not going to help you. Well, no. I mean, it's probably a good thing to delete Facebook, but the problem is bigger than that. And that now, actually, it's having a smartphone. So it's my horrendous new device that I just got, which carrying the smartphone is actually giving more information than logging into Facebook. So yes, it's complicated. How do you challenge it? Well, I think that's why I wrote the book, really, and it's why I didn't just write another, civil society report or a sort of submission to Parliament.
It was a great thing to do because it's your story. You tell a great I want to make it clear. Not many lawyers can write for a general public. Honestly, I mean, it's really true. They lose it. The training to write law stuff usually destroys it.
Yeah.
And you've written it in a way that is really about talking to an audience like this.
Well, that's what I hope. So that my belief is that maybe this is the start of a wider conversation. And I've also sort of talked really about the importance of organising, of civil society. We can't do it as individuals. And it's also about who you vote for and putting politicians on the spot and, hoping that they won't go and work for Facebook when you vote them out.
Please.
Just
You started mentioning credit ratings and reportings. And with China kind of taking that on a step and kind of having an index on virtuousness and employers here running algorithms for all your social and kind of doing exactly the same thing, are we heading towards everyone kind of being somewhere on a kind of obedience or virtuousness index?
I think we already are, but I think in this country we call it risk. But I think it's basically the same. And I think that there's been several reports of insurance premiums, car insurance premiums. There are a couple that I mention in the book where they found that I think it was nearly £1,000 more you'd pay if your name was Mohammed than if it was John. You know, once you'd gone through the algorithm. And, you know, it's magic, but, well, what is the commonality? And I think it was The Sun that reported on that. And there'd been a similar race premium reported recently, just in the last couple of months. And so by sort of saying this is going through very complex algorithms, so we don't know, it's just, but the computer understands better, they're sort of disguising that fundamental issue. But it is, by running it through this sort of automated systems, I think they're sort of laundering virtue, if you like, and saying, well, no, this is about risk, and you as a risky person, but we can't actually say exactly what it is about you or what you've done that makes you risky, but the computer understands. And that's the thing. I think it is the same as this social credit idea, fundamentally.
Who else would like to come in? Oh, sorry, forgive me, I hadn't realised.
So kind of going off of that with the international law systems that we have in place now, you talk a lot about human rights law, and obviously there's absolutely a violation there. Where do you also see other areas of international law, particularly international humanitarian law, or laws around the use of force, if this is kind of a new technology, again, being used against people? Is it similar to, could it be regulated through those kinds of legal spheres?
I think potentially. I mean, there is that crossover. I think it depends. And actually, the OSCE. Sorry, I'm going to put Alvaro here. Is someone I've worked with at the OSCE, and the OSCE works a lot in the kind of human rights and humanitarian law sphere, and about the law of armed forces. And I think certainly, as we mentioned earlier, in the kind of defence and security direction, is where there is a lot of these kind of developments happening. And so I think you have to look at it with a really sort of global perspective. But one of the reasons, again, why I found the right to freedom of thought to be such a persuasive legal tool is because it's an absolute right. So like the prohibition on torture.
There are very few absolute rights.
Yeah.
You know, almost all of them are balanced, you know. And
taken away by Dominic Raab?
Ooh.
No comment.
He sure does. He wants to get rid of the Human Rights Act. So it'd be
Watch this space.
Well, yes.
It won't change on international law, though, anyway, regardless of what happens nationally.
Yeah, I don't imagine that they're going to want to be seen to be doing that. However.
What about Channel 4?
I don't have any particular thoughts about Channel 4 today.
No,
but
the fact that they're doing this to Channel 4, so I don't care what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that we're moving into another area when we start talking about that.
There's one other person.
Yeah.
Very quickly, who's the onus on then to safeguard freedom of thought?
Well, I mean, from a human rights perspective, states have an obligation to protect our freedom of thought as well as to not violate it. But that then comes down as well to us calling on our states and making sure that they do, you know, what's in our best interests, I suppose.
Listen, the thing is that there's quite a large currency just now in libertarianism, as you know, and you have the right-wing libertarians and left-wing libertarians, and they sometimes meet behind the bicycle shed and make common cause. But libertarianism is having its moment in the sun, and therefore I don't see, I think if there was a challenge to be made directly on the business of freedom of thought, governments would not want to be seen to be interfering with it.
No, absolutely.
Absolutely not.
Hi, I'm a techie, but I write only good programs. My question was, have we got to the point where we're already junkies? If you remember what happened with OnlyFans, where they tried to clamp down on some of the things that were going on the platform, And the people who protested were not the lawyers, they were not the regulators, but the people using the platform, because they said, that's my only source of income. Have we gone beyond the point of no return?
I don't really believe in a point of no return, to be honest. I kind of always believe that we as individuals and as societies have the capacity to evolve, putting away climate disaster to one side. But otherwise, I believe that we can evolve. And I think, we've seen massive social and economic forces committing human rights atrocities globally in the past that may at the time, things like the East India Company, at the time when J.S. Mill was writing on liberty and working for the East India Company, probably no one could imagine its end, that things do change and we do move forward. And sometimes that happens in a great leap, and sometimes it happens just because lots of individuals start changing the way they behave, or start voting differently, or start calling for change. So I don't ever believe there's a point of no return, or I couldn't be a human rights lawyer.
Yes, over there, please.
Hi, I've got a quick question. So you talk about the law and the distinction between ethics and the law. How confident are you that we have a judicial system and judges that would be able to apply the principles? I mean, we've got innovation, we've got young techies that are coming up with new ideas. I mean, I must admit, I struggle keeping up with it. So just wondered if you could just comment on what you think of the judicial system and how it may respond to this challenge.
Well, before we talk about judges, let me just tell you, I'm in the House of Lords. I was in a queue at the room where if something goes wrong with your technology, you go to have it fixed. And there's an old lord there, and I said to him, "Oh, are you getting yourself a website?" And he said, "Helena, I don't want a website, I want eyesight." and I strongly believe that our judges, a lot of them are in that category, that they're not quite sure, about the whole reach of this business of technology, and on some of these complex issues, it would be pretty demanding of their.
It may be, but again, I'm more positive about the future of the judiciary.
Good. So, we want you in there. I want you to be one of them.
I believe that there are judges coming up, and I believe that it is something that we'll tackle. And I think a bigger threat is about watering down the potential for judicial review and these sorts of areas. I think as long as the judges have the laws that they can use to be effective, then I believe that the judiciary will be. But it's about making sure that they have both the laws and the space to exercise effective judicial oversight.
Thank you. Would you be interested in working with some of the judges then and speaking to them?
I'm trying to persuade this woman to become a judge. I think that's where we need.
I do work with judges.
She works with judges very closely, and she does sit. I have to tell you,
yes, part-time.
She sits part-time as a judge, and we want her to become a full-time one.
Okay, thank you very much.
And wouldn't that be great? Anyway, is there anyone else who'd like to come in before we draw this to a conclusion?
Yeah.
Oh, please, yes.
Sure, thanks. Just two things quickly. Firstly, in terms of the IHL question, prisoners of war, there are regulations around their freedom of thought, so that's where the only place in IHL that comes up. In terms of a question, when you're trying to regulate things, when you try and regulate tech, people innovate and they think of new tech. But then, so is the answer to regulate the people, but then my question would be, how do you regulate in terms of trying to protect from these harms, the people themselves and the structures and the systems when innovation allows the people to get around it?
I think it's just about looking at what the point is. So it's instead of looking at the details of how the tech works, you just say, actually, you're not allowed to profile and target people based on an assessment of what's going on inside their head. It doesn't matter how you do that. And yes, there might be people who dress it up in careful ways and create complex legal arguments around that. But as I said earlier, I genuinely believe that most people don't want to be seen or to be doing things that are very clearly illegal. I mean, I don't think we have had a massive outpouring of subliminal advertising in Europe since it was banned before it even got off the ground. I think it just sends things in a different direction. But you obviously have to keep an eye on which direction things are going in. in order to recognise new threats. But I don't think it's about the detail. It's about setting down these guardrails of saying, actually, no, you can't go in this direction.
But it does mean that you have to have liberal democracies, because without liberal democracies, then, of course, you know that it becomes much harder to do that sort of carefully judging and balancing. Anyway, I want to, we're getting towards the end of this wonderful discussion. It's coming up for 8 o'clock. I just wanted to say, it really is a fabulous book. I really would recommend it to all of you. It's provocative, but it's engaging, and it's written in a most wonderful way. But it's also intellectually demanding, and I really think it is. If there came a moment where a particular book was the right one for the time, this is the one for now. So,
thank you, Helena.
There's really not much to add other than thank you sincerely for riveting, sobering, terrifying, alarming, and important discussion, which you've galloped through the main chapters of the book in a really tantalizing way that hopefully will encourage anyone who doesn't have a copy to pick up a copy. So thank you on behalf of the Conduit. Thank you all for being here, but please join me one final time to thank Baroness Helena Kennedy and Susie Alegre.